Hi, in this lesson, you'll learn about the CSS Grid model. CSS offers many different layout styles to help you organize your website. These styles are often customizable and can be relatively easy to implement with basic CSS terms. In this lesson, you're going to explore the grid layout. The grid layout is a popular model that uses rows and columns to lay out content in a grid-like manner. Now you may be thinking that your content doesn't really fit into a grid. And that's okay, because the grid is flexible. You can customize the size of each block to allow infinite options to hold content. The grid layout can be used to fit common content layouts such as the header, footer, and nav bar that you might see on a website. And since the content is defined by CSS, you don't necessarily see the grid. It just provides a place to put content relative to other content on your website page. To use the CSS grid layout, most of the layout is in the CSS file. You will create at least two different CSS classes for the grid, a container and an item. You may have multiple formats for different items, but you'll have at least one of them. Let's look first at the container. The container will start with a display type. For this lesson, we're always going to use grid as our display type. Next, you will define the column widths. The number of widths you define will determine the number of columns. In this case, you will get a grid with 3 columns, all 90 pixels wide. You can also specify an auto size option. Auto size will adjust the size to take up any available space. In this case, the left and right columns will be 90 pixels, and the 2 center columns will each use half of the remaining space. The item layout allows you to provide basic formatting for the items. The style would result in a grid like this. Notice that the 2 middle columns are equal size and slightly bigger because of the auto setting. To add the content side of the grid, you will create a div with a container class. Each child under that container is then a cell in the grid. The item class is used to help define the style. The CSS grid layout is very flexible and can be customized for different projects. For example, if you want a cell that spans multiple columns, you can use the grid column property. Specify which column the item will start in and how many columns it'll span. Likewise, the grid row property allows you to create an item that spans multiple rows. Again, you specify the starting location and how many rows. You've only scratched the surface with respect to the CSS grid layout. If you want to find out more settings, check out the CSS grid options on W3 Schools for a more complete list of all the features. With that, let's take a look at this in the editor. Okay, so let's take a look at our example. So notice we have a nice grid here. We have defined a couple different classes, but right now they're all basically doing the same. So starting off with the container, notice that I have the container 90, 90, 120. I can actually change this. So if I wanted to change that and make it a little bit bigger, notice how that column gets bigger. I can also use an auto here, at which point it's going to take up the remaining space that it has. And so again, if I make that bigger, it takes up more space, smaller, it takes up less. Let's go back to 90 for that one. Okay, now what I want to do is I actually want to make this first column span 2. And this one, if you look back in my one, it was called left item. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to left item and I'm going to say grid column, and I'm going to specify that I want it to start at 1 and span 2 different columns. And notice how I do that, and let's change this to a tomato color so that we can see it a little bit differently. Okay, now I do have an extra one here, and we're going to get rid of that in a second when we're going to bump another one down here. So I'm going to do the same thing with this right. So I'm going to say grid column. Now I want to start at 2, so I want this one to go from 2 to 3, so I'm going to do 2 and then also span 2. Okay, and then my right column was my number 4, or my right item. And again, I'll turn this one to tomato. Okay, and the third thing I want to do is I want to show you how I can take this column 3 and make that one a tall item. So this one is going to be a grid row, and I'm going to start at row 2, and I want to span 3 rows. So I'm going to say span 3 rows. Actually, I'm going to span 2 rows to go to 3. So start at row 2, span 3, and again, I'll change this one. Let's change this one to blue, although I might not be able to read the number very well. Okay, yeah, that number's a little hard to read, so let's go back to tomato for that one. Okay, and again, I can now specify that, and I get my grid, so I'm having this one take up 2, that one take up 2, and I can really specify however I want. If I want to make this first column really small, I can go down to 30 pixels. Everything kind of shrinks on me, and you notice I don't even have enough space in there for it. So let's go up to 50. But a lot of flexibility here, and then I can again go back to an auto, and so that I take up the remaining space with my thing. So now go ahead and play around on your own.